Hello, I'm Heather with Bernina of America, and today, welcome to Creative Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to make this cute little wall hanging or table runner quilt using a variety of scraps. It's from the pattern Summer Skinnies. Let's get started. I'm going to talk to you about some of the supplies that you need to successfully complete this project. First, you're going to need the pattern Summer Skinnies. Then you're going to need a variety of Bernina presser feet. I like to use the number 23 clear Bernina applique foot. Then you're going to use the number 20D foot open toe applique. The number 97D, which is our 1/4 inch piecing foot. And the number 71 foot, which is our lap seam foot. We're going to use this foot for putting on bindings. And I'm also going to use our Bernina stitch regulator for doing some free motion quilting in the background of my piece. A few other supplies that you will need. You'll need some pins, a pair of scissors, a rotary cutter and mat, an 11-inch square ruler, your favorite Fusible. I like to use Heat and Bond, a pressing cloth for pressing your applique designs, an iron and an ironing mat, and a nice light box. The first thing that we're going to do is create our background foundation piece. You're going to cut a piece of fabric that's 10.5 by 24.5. Then you're going to cut your strips for your heart. And I chose a variety of red and blue fabrics with a variety of prints. I also chose to cut them in a variety of widths. So I have strips at 1, 1.5, 2, and 2.5 inches, and I will piece those together. And then I have my border pieces that are cut at 2.5 inches by the length of fabric, and my binding pieces that are also cut at 2.5 inches by the length of fabric. Next, we will trace our applique. Now I'm going to show you how to trace your pattern onto your Fusible. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your pattern and you're going to tape it together so that you have one nice continuous long piece with this heart and the little star. And I'm going to place my pattern on my light box. Now make sure that your pattern doesn't call for you to reverse your applique design. Some patterns do. This one is very simple and it does not, so it makes it great. So I have my pattern on my light box. I'm going to turn on my daylight wafer light box. So I have my light, and now I can easily see my pattern. I'm going to take my Fusible, and be sure that you're tracing your design on the paper side of your Fusible and not on the fusible side of your Fusible. Ask me how I know this. Okay, so we're going to take our design and place our Fusible. Make sure that our Fusible covers our whole entire design that we want to trace. And this one's short. All right, now I'm going to take my marker, and I do like to use a marker when I am tracing designs on Fusible. That way I don't end up with rubbage from my hand if I happen to swipe over the design. And I'm simply going to follow the lines. So with my marker, I'm going to follow the lines from my pattern piece and trace my design onto my Fusible. Now that you have your completed design traced onto your Fusible, you're going to take and cut away the excess Fusible before you fuse this onto your fabric. So I'm just going to simply take my scissors and I'm going to just cut out my shapes. I'll do this with the heart as well, but you just want to leave a little bit of Fusible around your edges away from your traced line so that you get a good bond when you fuse this onto your fabric. We are going to piece together a variety of our strips to make our background for our heart applique. So what I have done is I have taken one of my 2.5 inch strips and a 1 inch strip, and I've pinned them together. I've attached my 97D foot with my seam guide to my Bernina 790 machine, and I'm going to piece these pieces together. So I'm going to line my foot up, and I have my fabric lined up with the edge of my seam guide, And I have this attachment so that it's easy when I start stitching. I can just run the fabric along the edge of that guide and I get my nice 1/4 inch seam. Of course, I don't want to stitch over my pins. When you get to the end of your stitching, I like to use the scissors button on my machine. Now, I am going to go ahead and give this a good press in between adding my next row of fabric. The reason I like to go ahead and press is because then I don't end up with things looking wonky or curved or ripply. So I'm just going to quickly give my fabric seam a good press here. Now that I have my piece pressed, I'm going to add my next piece of fabric. I do like to have different widths of fabric as I'm building this base. And the reason being is it just kind of gives it a more whimsical look. So I'm just going to quickly pin this in place and stitch another 1/4 inch seam. Once you've gotten your various fabric strips pieced together and pressed, you do want to take and make sure that you have enough strips together to accommodate your applique piece. So I just like to audition my applique piece on top of my strips just to make sure that I have enough length to accommodate the whole entire applique. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fuse our applique on to the wrong side of our fabric. So I'm going to lay my applique piece, my fusible applique down, and on this particular design I'm going to turn my heart just a little bit sideways to give it more of a whimsical feel. The other thing I want to make sure of is down here on this little point of the applique that I'm not ending up with my applique being right on a seam. That's going to be a little bit challenging when you go to stitch this down. So I'm going to move my piece just so that I can make sure that the point of my heart ends in a nice piece of fabric. So I have that laid down. I'm going to take my OESD pressing cloth and I'm going to lay it over top of my fusible. This will protect my iron from any of the fusible that may transfer to it. So now I'm simply going to take my iron and press, and you would want to do this and follow your manufacturer's instructions for your fusible that you're using. But I'm going to press this all down and give it a good press. I like to wait about 5 seconds in an area just so that I can make sure that the heat transfers nicely from my fusible and adheres my design to my fabric. And I like to use steam. Then I'm going to simply pull back my OESD pressing cloth, and I now have my design pressed on to my fabric strips. You can also press from the front if you'd like, if you're concerned with your fusible at all, making sure everything adheres nicely. You want to let your fusible on your applique pieces cool just a little bit before you start cutting it out. So I have my star and my fusible has cooled onto my fabric, so I'm simply going to cut out exactly on the drawn lines. So I'm going to take my fabric scissors and I'm just going to cut this out exactly on my drawn lines. Now I have my little star piece cut out. I'm going to take and do my fusible onto my background. So I have my heart that I cut out, and I'm going to take and I want to show you a trick on how to get the fusible off the back of your applique pieces. So what I like to do is I like to take and bend or simply just rip a little bit, and the paper will separate from your fusible, and you are able to then easily peel your fusible webbing off of your project, your paper backing off of your project, and it'll leave behind your fusible. If you've fused it right. Here we go. See how slick that was? So I'm just going to peel this off. I'm going to place my design on the right side of my background fabric. So I want my fusible to be on the top or on the right side of my background fabric. So I'm just going to place my heart wherever I want on the background. I'm going to do that same little trick on my star. and simply peel that off as well. And then just audition different places that you like your star, and it can be wherever you want it on the top part of your heart. And I'm going to take my OESD pressing cloth, again, lay this over top of my applique to protect everything, and I'm going to fuse this into place with my hot iron. Again, I like to use a little bit of steam. You count to 5, and then move it around. Now that I have this fused into place, I'm ready to start stitching. So now we're going to move on to the next part and stitch our applique piece in place. We are now going to attach our outside borders to our background piece with our fusible heart. So I have pinned my borders into place, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam down the long side. I like to start with the long sides first and then do the top and bottom border. So again, with my machine at the default settings for my straight stitch, I'm simply going to stitch a quick 1/4 inch seam the length of my border. Once I have my border stitched on, I do like to press. I'm going to press away from my background fabric. So I'm going to take it and I'm just going to give it a good press away from my background. I now have my piece with my top and bottom borders, and it's ready to start the applique process. All right, so for doing your applique, I like to use the number 23 clear machine applique foot. The reason I like to use this foot over the number 20 foot is the foot is clear, and there's also a little groove on the inside bottom part of the foot that you can line your applique up against, and there's a channel so that your stitches will nicely form and not snag on anything. The other reason I like to use the number 23 applique foot is it has a rounded toe in the front of the foot, and it doesn't get caught up on any of my corner pieces that I'm using. One of the features on my Bernina 790 that I like is the hover feature, and I'm going to show you how to program the hover feature on your machine. So I'm going to go to my settings menu, and I'm going to go to my stitches, and I'm going to go to my personalization and the needle down feature. And I can choose one of these 3 hover features to have the machine hover the presser foot when the needle is in the down position. I'm going to choose the middle hover position, as that one is my favorite, but you might want to experiment with the different features and find one that you like the best. I'm also going to select the needle down feature so that when I do stop stitching, my machine will stop needle down and my presser foot will hover over my project, allowing me to easily turn it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare our applique piece for stitching. On applique pieces, you generally want to use something to stabilize your stitching, whether that be a tearaway stabilizer or, in this case, a piece of batting. The reason on small projects like this that I like to use a piece of batting is I accomplish a couple of things while I'm stitching. One, I'm supporting my background fabric and my piece as I'm stitching my blanket or decorative stitch. The other reason I like to use a piece of batting when I'm doing this is because as I'm stitching my decorative stitch or my blanket stitch, I'm quilting my piece at the same time. We are now ready to blanket stitch our applique design onto our background fabric. However, I want to add a little bit of a whimsical flair, and because I have the Bernina 790 with Stitch Designer, I can design my own custom blanket stitch. Let me show you how I like to design a custom blanket stitch. I'm going to open the Stitch Designer feature, and I'm going to create a new stitch design. So I'm going to select that icon, and on this blanket stitch, I'm going to touch the screen, and I'm going to use my snap to grid icon, touch the screen, and I'm going to come down 2. I'm going to go over to the left 5, and I'm going to come back to center. I'm going to come down 2 more. I'm going to go over to the left 3, and I'm going to come back to center. And then I'm going to come down 2, over 2, and back to center. And you can see in your stitch design field on the left what your stitch is going to look like prior to stitching it out. I like the way this looks, so I'm going to hit the green check mark to confirm, and now I have a custom blanket stitch that I have created in Stitch Designer. I can still adjust the stitch width and length if I'd like to make it even that much more custom. Now we're going to start the applique process. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select my securing knot feature on my Bernina 790. What this is going to do is this is going to take 4 securing stitches before it starts taking my new custom made blanket stitch that I created in Stitch Designer. So I'm going to align the inside edge of my presser foot with the edge of my star fabric for my applique. I'm now going to let my machine take the 4 stitches, and it's going to start taking the custom made blanket stitch. I'm going to stitch around my design, and when I stop needle down, my machine is going to hover the presser foot for me so that I can easily turn and continue stitching around my shape. You're going to continue doing this around your star until you have it stitched into place. Now that we've got our star stitched in place with our whimsical blanket stitch that we made in Stitch Designer, we're going to use a more traditional blanket stitch and stitch around the outside edge of our heart. So I'm going to go to my quilting stitch folder, and I'm going to choose stitch number 1329, which is my blanket stitch. However, I like to adjust my blanket stitch, and I want to give this piece a little bit of a whimsical feel. So I'm going to adjust the stitch width and the stitch length of my blanket stitch. So my stitch length, I'm going to adjust it to 4.50, and my stitch width, I'm going to adjust it to 5.50. This will make my stitch look like I've done it by hand. I also like to use these settings when I'm doing wool applique, and I can create a hand stitch look on my machine. So again, I'm going to start with my securing knot feature on my machine. I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to let the machine take the securing knots, and then I'm going to begin to blanket stitch around the edge of my fabric. You want to make sure that the edge of your blanket stitch, when it swings to the right, that it's stitching on the edge of your fabric. The other thing is that when I stop needle down and it hovers, I'm easily able to turn my fabric to complete my stitch. Remember, this is not a race. You want to go slow and take your time and let the machine form the stitch, especially when you're going around curves and points. There are times I may go 1 stitch at a time, turn my fabric, take a stitch, and again turn my fabric so that my stitch will continue to form perfectly on the edge of my applique. Complete this process all the way around your heart, and use your securing knot feature when you get back to the end or the beginning of your stitching. You've completed your applique stitching around the outside edge of your heart and also around your star. Now, we can also embellish our design if we want to by adding some decorative stitches anywhere in this heart area, and I chose to do that. So I went into my decorative stitch folder and I chose folder number 901, and I like stitch number 906. So I chose that stitch, and I also have attached my 20D foot to my machine. This is my open toe foot. I like to use the 20D foot when I'm doing decorative stitches. So I am going to place a couple rows of this star stitch anywhere on my design that I'd like. So I'm simply just going to line up the edge of my presser foot with one of my seam lines actually, and it is the left edge of my presser foot with one of my seam lines because of the way the star stitch forms. This star stitch, if you look at it on your screen, it forms to the right. So that's why I'm lining up the left edge of my presser foot on one of my seams. So when I get done, it's going to look like I've stitched my stars right on that seam. So go ahead and continue this process. When you get to the end, be sure that you use your securing knot feature and your pattern end button so that it will complete your stitch pattern. Now that you've got your piece stitched around and all of your blanket stitching done, I went ahead and layered my piece with my backing and my batting. And on small projects like this, I do like to use a little bit of spray baste rather than pin basting my layers together. So I went ahead and spray basted my pieces together. I've also attached my Bernina stitch regulator, and I'm going to do some free motion quilting in the background of this. I'm not going to stitch in the heart area, but you could. I've already stitched my heart down and quilted it because I did my blanket stitch through my batting, and then I did some decorative stitches as well. So to begin with our Bernina stitch regulator, I'm going to secure my threads by simply pulling up my bobbin thread, so I've got my bobbin thread and my top thread. I'm going to take just a couple of stitches in place to secure my threads, and then I'm going to start, and on this I am going to do a little stippling stitch. So I'm going to quilt my background and do a little stippling. You could also quilt off into your borders if you'd like. I'm not going to choose to do that because I'm going to get my border area when I attach my binding. Just continue to do your background quilting until your piece is completely quilted. Then we'll talk about trimming off your excess fabric and batting. We've quilted our background piece and we've trimmed away the excess batting and backing. And now we're going to attach our binding. Typically with a binding, you cut a 2.5-inch strip and then you iron it so that the raw edges are together. I also like to iron so that I have a nice little pleat here in the front, or a crisp edge, to a nice finished edge to start with. And so I've pressed this down and then over. So I have this nice finished edge when I start and stop for my binding. Typically on a quilt, you attach the binding, raw edges together from the front side and flip them to the back side and hand stitch them down. I'm not going to hand stitch today. I'm actually going to show you a different method for attaching your binding using our number 71 lap seam foot. But first, for this method, I'm going to take and I'm going to turn my piece over to the back, and I'm going to attach my binding to the back side of my runner. So I'm going to match up my raw edges, and I'm going to use my 97D foot again, this time without my guide. So I'm going to start just a little bit in from my edge of my binding. And I'm going to stitch all the way around and attach my binding to my quilt top, mitering my corners as I go. So let me show you. I'm going to keep sewing. And on my 97D foot, it has a 1/4 inch mark at the beginning of the foot and also at the end of the foot. I'm going to stop just at the edge of my fabric with my mark on the front of my foot. That way I know I'm a good 1/4 inch from the edge of my fabric. I'm going to go ahead and cut my threads. Then I'm going to take and fold my binding into a nice mitered corner. So I'm going to fold my edge up even, my folded edge up even with the edge of my fabric, and then my raw edge is going to line up again with this piece, my next edge that I'm going to stitch. And I'm going to start and stitch my corner, stitching in my miter as I go. Again, stitching a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge and keeping my raw edges together. I'm going to continue this method all the way around and attach my binding. Now we are going to attach our binding using the number 71 foot. So I have taken my binding, I've flipped it to the front, and I've clipped it with my Wonder Clips. I've attached my number 71 foot, and I'm going to line the edge of my binding up with my presser foot. I want to tuck this binding fabric over this edge of my presser foot. It's going to help keep my binding in place and nicely stitch it down. I've selected my straight stitch, and I'm simply going to start stitching my binding. When I do this, it's stitching the binding just about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the binding, but the presser foot is helping to keep everything lined up nice and straight. When I get to a mitered corner, I like to stop just a little bit before the mitered corner. I'm going to untuck the fabric, maybe. There we go. When you get to the edge and a mitered corner, you want to take the fabric away from the lip on the presser foot. I want the presser foot to ride on top of the binding fabric. That way, as I go to the corner here, this edge of my presser foot doesn't get caught on my binding. I'm going to continue to stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch into my corner, stop needle down, and because I have the hover set, it still allows me to pivot my fabric nicely because my machine is hovering my presser foot. I'm going to take a couple stitches away from my corner, and I'm simply going to tuck my fabric back in to my presser foot and continue stitching. We have now completed our table runner or wall hanging. We hope you enjoyed this. For more lessons like this, visit Bernina Creative Studio or your local Bernina dealer.